Hi, everyone. I'm Carla Johnson, and one of the most iconic buildings in the world is the Sydney Opera House. Danish architect Jorn Utzon designed the building taking inspiration from history, from nature, and from Chinese architecture. Now, it's nicknamed the Shells, but he actually originally designed the building to look like sails, to be a conglomerate of sails in the harbor of Sydney. But when inspiration hits reality, sometimes things change, especially in the world of architecture. So to make the building actually something that could be constructed, the design was changed and the building now looks like shells, hence its nickname. Now, the idea of inspiration and how and where architects get it is something that has been fundamental to me in my career, because the world of architecture and marketing is where I started my whole career. And one of the things that has been so profound in working with architects is understanding with any experience, how do we want people to feel? Now, knowing that, how do you reverse engineer whatever you create, design, construct, whether it's a physical building or whether it's an experience that your brand delivers? How do you become more innovative in what it is that you deliver? Now, this whole idea of creativity, design, pop culture, it's something my guest today, a longtime friend of mine, is so fun to talk about. So I'm very excited to welcome Tom Trenolone to the Connect the Dots episode today. Connect the Dots is the show where we dig into the world's most prolific innovators, how they come up with their ideas, where they get them, and what they do with them, how they actually put them into practice. Tom, I'm delighted to have you join me here today on Connect the Dots.
Hey, Carla, it is really good to see you. Like I said, longtime friend, so this is pretty awesome, and I'm honored to be included in some of the great folks you've had on the program. So thank you.
Well, and I want to mention this. Tom was named the top architect 40 under 40. He's earned the designation as a fellow in the AIA, and there's only something like 3,200 fellows out of 80,000 members of the AIA. So everybody listening, Tom Trenolone knows his stuff. If you're an architecture fan, I would want to encourage you, throw your questions up. He has just a little bit of weighty things that he's produced recently. This one is called 3.3, which I'll have you explain a bit. This is about rural resolve, and it's about healthcare in rural areas. And you are in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where we met.
Yep. Yeah. We've both been different places since then. I mean, we've been all over the place since I think the first time we got together in Omaha. I mean, you making your trip off to South America and then coming back, and then I think Amy and I went over to Europe for a little bit, and then Texas. But yeah, Omaha is where we find ourselves. Amy and I have been here now for the last 15 years.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing now for HDR and how you take a different spin on design, because I imagine, just like any industry, sometimes clients they say they want different, but when it comes down to what different looks like, sometimes they're not always as open to those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the nail on the head. The type of client is, I always make the joke that using the Star Wars analogy is like Yoda said something like, forever will dominate your destiny. Well, your clients and who you select to work with will dominate exactly where you go to. And we've been very lucky in the fact that we've been very, let's just say, diverse in what we choose to. Like, just in the stuff that you see behind is everything from a small 8-bed critical access hospital to a public library. And that is kind of what we tried to do in the studio, is make sure that we like to have, I'm a big fan of Brian Uzi, who wrote this fantastic treatise on Broadway musicals. And I take away from that always is we put together teams of a 1/3, 2/3, where 2/3 of the people know their stuff, know exactly what they're doing with the building type. And then 1/3 is brought in to be kind of a novice or an individual that can really question and ask, why do we do it this way? And that's been pretty much the treatise to how we do things in what we call the Great Plains Studio here in Omaha. We're a global company all over the place, but those of us that occupy space in Omaha, Nebraska, are part of the Great Plains Studios.
And I like that. And I think that was something I was so happy that I learned, and so happy that I started out my career in architecture, is watching architects, and I think design architects in particular are some of the most well-read and well-traveled people I've ever met. And I think that's why they're so great at the work that they do, because like you're just talking about inspiration from a Broadway musical about how you design, architect, no pun intended, architect and design teams. But you and I, whenever we sit down and talk, it is like the most random collection of where inspiration or ideas came from. And that's before we start to have drinks. So I just want to make that very clear to all of our listeners. But I find that fascinating. And I also find it fairly unique to the architecture profession outside of, if you look at graphic design or traditional artists or something like that. Why do you think it is so unique to architecture and something that other industries really don't understand or I guess give credit to?
Well, I mean, I would say that some of those are the interesting thing there, like you said, traveling is like sometimes to really experience a building, we were just talking about the Sydney Opera House. I just got a chance to mark that off my calendar or my bucket list just recently. But it's something where, although you can read all kinds of books on it, you can see it on the internet. They have drones that are flown around it now. You have to kind of really be there to truly experience what's going on. And I think that that's probably the one where it's unique to the discipline. But I would say all designers in a lot of cases they usually have a wanderlust of sorts where they want to see it in person. They really want to see how the artist did it. They want to see how the architect accomplished the detail. I mean, because it is one of those situations, just like you talked about, Utzon with the Sydney Opera House, like the original sketch and then what the building became when he needed to have it realized in physical form and be able to defy gravity and everything. It took a very significant transformation in regards to that. And you can't always get that out of, as awesome as the internet is, sometimes you just have to see it in person. I mean, I can only imagine like when you guys went over to Spain, I mean, there's some stuff there that it's like, if you've never seen Antonio Gaudi's cathedral in person, it is difficult to truly appreciate the brilliance and marvel that it is, right? I mean, it's that unique.
And it truly is. And the first time that my husband and I saw it was in 2001, June of 2001. So if we look at what's happened in 20 years, they've made pretty good progress in 20 years. Even though you look at, they've been working on 125 years or something like that. But, I think they got a better project manager these last 20 years because they're really showing a lot of progress. But it is something that you have to truly step into and experience in its entirety, in that 3D kind of experience.
I think it's brilliant too, because when you study the history of the way cathedrals were built, in the longest time, so many of them, they are century-long buildings where it took forever to finally get the towers done and everything. And so I love that about the fact that Gaudi's building is being worked on continually at this point. I mean, I think it's really it's a very romantic moment, at least for me.
It is. And to your point, every time I go by there, because when we lived in Spain, we lived just literally blocks from it. And I would walk by it every single day. And the wow factor never, ever wore off. No. And I could sit there and just look at it for hours at a time. And there was always something new and magical that I would discover, like a little face that was in a cornice or something like that. And
I think that's the other reason, like when you ask why people travel, and the other one is the scale. Your ability to control how you want to see it via scale is really another thing where you can go around the corners and see different things, like you said, define that, and you can determine that. I think, when you asked the question originally to come on the show was about creativity. It is very much about that idea of, I think that like when you, I was just telling you, recently I got a chance to finish your book. I think it was great.
Oh, thank you.
I think there's an interesting thing that we as individuals, at least those of us in creative disciplines, it's like, I think we take for granted sometimes some of the things that are going on in our head that I think you really did a really good job of outlining in the book. So that, because I think that idea of just kind of taking time to experience, walk around, observe, I mean, that's all part of the creative process. And sometimes I don't know, maybe because life is so fast, we don't take the time to do that.
Do you think that some people are more inclined to be that way than others?
Oh, I think so. It was funny. I think I told you, Amy and I, my wife and I were having this conversation at breakfast this morning. It was like, I think a lot of it has a lot to do with sometimes environment. It has a little bit to do with your just the mindset. I mean, creativity, I think for the most part is pretty much it's being an open mindset. If you're open to different things, normally, I mean, some of the greatest moments that have like creativity in industry or design or whatnot, just usually came from an absurd observation that ultimately just made total sense, right? And it's just simply being. We always tell everybody that I think it's a skill set that you can really, just like a sport, you can get better at it. But there'll always be individuals that are, they're pros. They don't have to think about it. It just kind of goes through that. And sometimes it's amazing when even myself, I mean, there's been some awesome graphic designers and interior designers and other architects that I've had the opportunity to work with. And sometimes it is just amazing, even for somebody like me that does this every single day, to see how some of those people's brains work. I think like a personal experience of mine, like you talk about travel, as a student, graduate student, I got a chance to go to Prague, and I got to see Fred and Ginger, which is Frank Gehry's building that is in Prague, right off the river. And at the time, I always thought Frank Gehry was cool, but I never truly appreciated his genius until I saw that building in person. And it's one of those moments where, like I said, again, like when you travel, you could see it, dig it in the magazines, but really it didn't come together, and you didn't truly appreciate how it worked, how the function of different components of structure and different materials all came together until you actually had that moment. And what was amazing about it was, it is, if you've ever been to Prague is an incredibly Baroque city. I mean, and it was spared an awful lot of the damage that happened in the Second World War because of the Pope. The interesting thing about it is that when you go to try to find Fred and Ginger amongst all those all these Baroque buildings in Prague, it's hard to find because it fits in so well. And when you see it in the magazines, you think it's completely out of context, but that's so far from the reality of it.
Well, I've been to Prague, and I've seen that building, and it's stunning. And I think part of the emotional aspect of travel and seeing things in real life is how you're dwarfed by them, at least in architecture. And we were in Bilbao, Spain, toward the end of our stay in Spain, and the Guggenheim Museum there. I mean, it's one of 5 in the world. And that's another Frank Gehry building. And it truly is awe-inspiring to stand there and truly take it all in every detail. And that sounds a little cliche, but I think unless you're able to stand there and look and truly experience a building like that, you don't really understand it.
No, and it's interesting because in our own industry, it's like one of those things where basically the spectrum from one side to the other, where Frank Gehry could be one of these where he's incredible. I mean, it's incredibly, just dynamic and shapes and forms going everywhere. And then you contrast that with someone like Peter Zumthor, who is incredibly reserved, and his material selection is the best. His thermal valves in Switzerland. I mean, it's one of those where the simplicity of it. And then as an architect, I don't necessarily know if this is always appreciated by the layperson, but as an architect, when you see how incredibly well constructed and how everything comes together and all the parts and pieces meet, those are the kind of things too that it's like, I think when I think all of us in the creative industry, it's like you're always trying to do it better. You're never really, that's why we call it practice, right?
Yeah.
You're never truly done. You're attempting to do it better and better and better. And to learn from experiences like that, or like I said, they're priceless. And the other one too is like, and generally it's one of those things where I guess you can consider that work, but it's pretty fun. So I don't know if you could call that work.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with enjoying what you do every day, right?
Well, use it on your tax returns, I
Yeah.
guess, as a continued education.
And I agree with you that some people say I'm just not creative. And I do believe it's a skill that you can practice and improve. But what about an attitude? Do you think creativity is also an attitude as much as a skill?
Yeah, no, I think, like I said, when I say environment, I think exactly that. It is the environment that you create, not in your own, if it's only in your own head, but the one that, like I said, I'm speaking to you today. I work for a very large company. I always remember one of my favorite books when I was getting started was Orbiting the Giant Hairball by Gordon McKenzie, who is an art director at Hallmark. And the interesting thing is that great big organizations that are going to be successful, they need their creative people, but creative people they're weird sometimes, they're quirky. They don't necessarily have the same mindset sometimes as the bottom line as some of the CFOs or the controllers in the company. But it is one where I think that if all of those people are open, including yourself, you have to be open to your partners, your business partners. But if they're open to allow, some of your quirkiness to kind of seep in there, I think it leads to create a better culture and ultimately a much more successful organization or company.
And I just recently discovered that book and started to read it, and it's absolutely fantastic. And it is that thing, and that's why in my book Rethink Innovation, I talk about the 6 different archetypes of innovators, because I think especially as a company grows and scales and gets bigger, one of the things that people expect is that you're more logical in how you approach things, and you lose some of that energy and vibrancy that you have as either a smaller firm, a smaller company, whatever that might be. And that's how some of that creativity gets squashed.
Well, some of it is just, as time goes on, as we all get older, right? I mean, you go from where you're doing truly creative acts as a young member of the profession. And then as you get older, I mean, you have to start worrying about fees and everything. We talk about that, it's like, we're probably I think us architects, graphic designers, we're some of the worst in business sometimes. We really don't, we get so excited and so passionate about things. We don't always ask people, we do want to get compensated in some manner or form, right? And I think that's the one where in a good partnership, those individuals that are concerned about that are always good to have on your team. But you can't, it's all a balance. I know you know this so well. It's like, it is a significant balance on the fact of being able to be just crazy enough to really move things forward, and then being able to make sure that, the company doesn't go out of business. And I think that some of the greatest innovators that are out there, they've all had to do that balance where they have literally come to that almost the exact edge of completely crashing and blowing up, and they're able to hold it together and push through that. I think we were talking about that previously too. It's like, some of the toughest things I think for creative individuals sometimes, especially in larger organizations, is being able to stick to your guns and push through when people aren't necessarily convinced that you've got the right idea.
Mm-hmm.
You need to do your due diligence to make sure that you're not being cavalier or reckless. But the idea that innovation is scary stuff sometimes, or doing something different is very difficult. Especially in our business. I can tell you right now that sometimes, and many of my colleagues out there, it's like coming up with great ideas is the easy part. Once you have to actually start to construct and build them, especially sometimes with the elements of regulation such as fire code and planning regulations, they're sometimes the biggest hurdles to overcome in doing truly innovative things. But it is one where, like I said, I believe that when you have passionate and innovative people, they can usually find a way to circumvent things. I think about me that in all of our time together, even when I've stayed and I work at a relatively big company, I think sometimes I do that because I truly enjoy circumventing systems. It's one of the funnest.
I would absolutely agree. And I think, there seems to be people like you in certain organizations where somehow you can push and push and push that status quo, and you still end up having a job. And I think, because there are plenty of people who do push it. Ernie doesn't work here anymore.
I am very fortunate that, like you and I, that we have certain people that we know that on occasion I think have looked out and saved me from the pit once or twice.
So from yourself.
But I think that's another good point, though, is like when you talk about this idea of creativity, it's failure laden, right? It's one where you don't, for every time that you get it right, you've probably got about 6 or 7 times where you've completely crashed and burned. It is, I think I told you about, I spent in 2004, I did a fellowship where I spent some time with the folks at, I called it, the concept originally was automotive couture, but it eventually turned into a thing called speed, sex, and firepower. And speed was the automotive industry. So I spent some time with the guys at Audi in Simi Valley, California. And then we went and did a study in Milan with Prada, and then had some time with the guys at the Special Warfare College at Fort Bragg. And it's interesting because you wouldn't think that anybody in the military has got incredible creative thinkers. And the deal is that if you look at their history, a lot of it's fraught with a lot of danger and a lot of failure in that. And then every so often you get the brilliance of 1 or 2 just completely memorable and historic missions that, people are like, wow, that was brilliant. I always remember, I think it's the SAS that their motto is "He who dares wins," and that's typically the thing that the person that puts that idea out there that no one else was willing to go forward to it and be able to stick behind it, typically comes out in a good way. And I think like you've had some fantastic people on your show here that have been examples of individuals that have been able to do that by themselves or with their organizations.
Now, talk a little bit more about speed, sex, and firepower, because I know you're working on that as a book, right?
Yeah, I mean, when we did the fellowship, what came out of it is we tried to come up with this. I should say we. I mean, I came up with this idea. The philosophy is like speed is ultimately, it's about efficiency. The idea that you can get ideas out there. Like I said, you got to fail pretty regularly to get a good idea, but you have to do that fast in this day and age. Sex is typically not only the fact that me, I have an advertising degree as well as my architecture degree, and so that'll get you an extra 3 seconds of attention. But the other one is it's about market presence and ultimately, the idea that everybody has there's something that will allure them to you. And it goes back to that Yoda quote again, right? It's like you have great clients that are willing to take a little bit of risk and stuff, and that will define you. And usually you can attract them with the sex part is all about that. And then firepower is all about what we're doing right now, the two of us and your audience. It's like, it's the idea of our collective experiences and being able to share. I mean, we typically I like to say in our studio that it's a exchange and experience are the true constants of a creative culture. And it's one where getting here and just like anytime you and I can get together, like I said in my post on the internet, it's like anytime we get together and get a chance to just shoot the bull, we come away, I think, much richer and stuff. I know that sharing some of the experiences I've had and you've had, and then I love the fact that you work as a connector to do that, where I've been introduced to people that you've worked with, that I've come away again richer from that exchange, and I think that's a real important part. And it goes back to the idea of when you talk about it in your book, it's like that in itself, that experience and exchange is a big part of the skill sets that you outline in the book and how those work for people. I mean, going places and just wanting to just sit around and watch how people move and how families interact, regardless of language. Sometimes, you go to a foreign country, it's always kind of amazing for me to see what do they do. It's like everybody has to have certain parts of cities, right? We have to have plumbing, we have to have roadways, we have to have mail, we have mass transit, but everybody solves that problem just a little bit different depending on where you go in the world. I did a thing one year where I just took pictures of different mailboxes in different parts of the world, just traveled around, or jet bridges for that matter. And think of every time that you get on an airplane and how wonderful sometimes, like when you show up in like Zurich, Switzerland, and you step off, you come into this wonderfully glass-lined truss as you walk into the terminal. And, when I land back here in Omaha, it is corrugated metal all the way, two windows, there's one at the end of the jetway. And then, of course, if a plane's not parked there, you might get a nice view. But other than that, it's completely solid box, right?
And I've done that with doors. I've taken pictures of doors all around the world because in some places they're just highly functional, and others they're decorative architecture ornaments all on their own. And I think that's what's fun. So I want you to talk a little bit about this book, 33.3.
Yeah, 33.3. I think you're familiar with. A couple of years ago at HDR, we introduced an initiative called Opacity. And those of you that use Photoshop, you'll appreciate this, is that Opacity was all about the ability to toggle between 0 and 100%. And what we wanted to do is create a much more transparent culture about design in, like I said, a very big global organization. And so what we introduced was each year we would ask 5 members of either media critics, academic institutions, other architects or designers to come in and openly review our work and then curate their selections. What 33.3 represents is that is basically a combined version of the first 3 journals that we did, and it's turned into a monograph. And then we actually went out in the book itself. You have a number of original essays by some great individuals in the architectural community, such as Aaron Betsky, Katie Gerfen, Susan Cisnazi of Metropolis fame, Alyssa Walker, who's doing great stuff in LA, and an urbanist with Curb, and allowed them to express their opinion. And the big thing about it is that we offer that opportunity without any kind of real expectation of saying that it's not a marketing piece. We allow them to have true voice in that. And I think, again, it shows, again, from a transitioning a culture such as ours in a big company, it's that transition to a place of openness and exchange and experience, as opposed to rank and file. This is exactly the way it's got to be done, and that type of thing. It was like you said, and I think we were joking before we came on, that it has many uses as well. As it's a great read, but it also works to prop your computer up for a television or to, as a doorstop.
It's earned its heftiness, but I have this out in our family room, and anybody who comes by, they start flipping through it, and then I'm like, you have to give that back. You can't take that book with you, because it is fascinating. I mean, the photography alone, if you're an architecture or photography fan, it's fantastic. But the stories and everything behind it is wonderful.
But you can imagine, like, the real reason that got started as a young architect, I was having a hard time convincing some of my senior partners here that, we should be taking certain directions. And it was one where I told them, okay, let's do this. I said, you don't have to take my word for it, but let's do this. Let's invite these individuals, these experts. And I think it's another one. You can appreciate me that every time I do something, I usually try to do there's two or three things happening at one time. The other one too is, like, I live in Omaha, Nebraska. I don't live in New York. I don't get to, I don't have every single opportunity for a lecture or to go all the time. But these types of networking elements, like Opacity and others, allow for an opportunity to meet some great people. Some of them have become good friends. And the other one is just have some kind of critical exchange, because ultimately, I tell you, every time we talk about the architecture that we do, it is intended to be, we want it to be critically acceptable. I think it was Neil Denari that wrote a fantastic piece in Architect. I think it was when it was Architecture before it became Architect magazine. But it was all about the idea that some of us, where we're working for a large organization like this, we can sit there and actually create an opportunity for us to exchange with those people outside of the company.
Well, I think that's a really important point, because one of the things that I consistently hear from people about, I can't really be creative where I am, or, I'm just not, allowed to be an innovative thinker, is that I don't live in a place that has access to highly creative or innovative thinkers. And I'm just going to say it. I don't think Omaha, Nebraska has the stereotypical reputation of being a highly innovative, highly creative. It's not a Chicago, a New York, a San Francisco.
No, it is very much the Les Nessman of WKRP, right? I mean, there's so many people from our generation that's exactly it. Is only Les Nessman would think that Omaha's a dream, right?
But yet you're able to find this way to create this network of creativity, of critical thinkers. And what is it about that other people can learn from? So even if they say, well, I don't work in the right industry, I don't sell the right products, I still live in Omaha, or maybe Grand Island instead of Omaha, or Fargo, North Dakota. There's people give excuses for why they're not able to be more creative thinkers or do more creative projects. What kind of advice do you have for them, and how can they build this kind of network that you've built?
I don't know if it's a device, but I mean, you're right. It is a network. I mean, it's a situation where I think you have to have your clientele who are, and it's taken a while. You can imagine, I mean, Amy and I were gone for 10 years before we came back here. And then, I've been here now 15 years. And over that time, it's taken that time to find some of those clients that are interested in doing things very differently. I think the other one is especially like in a large organization like this, or if you're running your own shop, it's your partners, right? There's partners that come in and they make up for your shortcomings, or they help protect you. Like you talked about it. I have not been without controversy in my place of employment. I've had my moments when I've come to the edge and people have wondered, am I worth the squeeze? And I've had people that believed in me. And I think that's been one of those too. It's like, I think that, and those types of partnerships. And then I think the other one is like going back to the start of this entire thing, like you and I, it's like, we started together in a marketing department where it was one where I probably learned as much from you in my first year on the job that I did almost my entire time at university. And when you have great relationships with individuals like that, I think that makes the difference. I mean, it's kind of like the classic, that classic moment when they have the flashbacks in Jerry Maguire when they have Dickie Fox come on screen and Dickie Fox says, It's this business is all about personal relationships. And in a lot of ways, creativity is really, in addition to some of the processes that you can learn, and like you've outlined in rethinking innovation, it has a lot to do with the environment and the people that you decide to catch and have a drink with, or clients that are willing to take risk with you and understand that you're not perfect, but they know that you'll do the best you can to make sure that you can overcome as many pitfalls as possible. I don't know if I didn't give anybody the outline of how it is, but I think that it's an ecosystem, of course, that I think that you've talked about.
I think that's a great way to describe it, an ecosystem. And I know I learned a lot in my time of working at HCR about having a willingness to go ask people for their opinions, for their insights, people who I didn't normally work with. I mean, a lot of people, of course, outside of marketing, but I think even people who worked in other disciplines, other offices, other verticals, because you and I worked in healthcare architecture. And I remember one of the things that I asked many of the engineers at HCR in Omaha was, can you give me a list of the best books you've ever read? And I have to say, I mean, because I come from a family of left-brain engineers, and I was floored by the creativity and the kind of the quirkiness of their reading list. It was eye-opening for me. Yeah.
I think it's one of those things, though, too, is you can appreciate. It's like, I have stayed, part of my career too is I have stayed in areas that, I mean, it's not museums. I mean, museums, a lot of the time, like you said, the Bilbao and others, they're fantastic. And me, my father was a hospital administrator. And so the one area that I stay, and sometimes I think one of the reasons that we're successful is that not everybody wants to be creative in healthcare. Sometimes it's a pretty restrictive industry, and I think it needs it desperately. I mean, when we talk about, I think especially one of the causes that's near to my heart is rural communities, and how we can use design to make them better, especially in the crisis they are facing with healthcare and the
access to healthcare.
Yeah, and the fact that the critical access hospitals are just disappearing left and right, and they are typically the largest employers in a community. So when that hospital goes down, not only do people no longer have access to healthcare, there's probably maybe 10, maybe 15% of the population just lost their job or don't have a job.
Right, in a high quality, highly contributing to a community type of job.
But it is one where, like I said, I think that's the other one too. When you ask about creativity, is sometimes being willing to go into the areas that don't always have, because we all know that it's there's so many things that attract incredibly creative people. I think a lot of times anymore, it's finding those niches for really creative people, or people with those skills that can go into areas that are typically pretty closed, and people don't really want to mess with that kind of stuff.
It was interesting. A few years ago, I spoke with someone who said that there was a big drain on professional graduate architects because other industries were coming in and hiring them because they had the perfect skill set of very conceptual yet strategic and understanding how to implement it. And when we look at that thought process and what it requires to be an architect, because I think, maybe most people know architecture from Mike Brady, if they're older, or Three Men and a Baby or something like that. It's not all that sexy and romantic, and you have all the great stuff behind you of the outcome. And it's not just about coming up with that first original great idea. It's being able to have the ideas that solve the problems all the way out the door until a project is done.
I do think a couple of things, though, that are really, it sucks, but it's really nice at the same time, because I've lost a couple of really good staff recently to the development world. And now the fact is that, the great thing is that people are seeing the value of what we bring to, to that type of thing. And so they've had opportunities to go and work with developers where they're being compensated. They're taking the risk on the development, but they're being compensated when it's successful. And I think that's another one where I think architects, designers in general, are just fantastic partners for you to bring on into your industry. I just love the way that they think, and I agree that we went through the period. I think when we were getting out of college, the big raid on architecture was to get everybody into the sneaker business. Like Nike was grabbing everybody out of the architecture industry to come up and design sneakers, and ultimately that moved into other types of products. But I think that it's a good it's a solid education to get in the fact of critical thinking. I think we don't get enough credit for it. I mean, I think that the guys at IDEO and the great stuff that they did, they really kind of wrote the book on it. But in a lot of cases, a lot of architects would tell you that they pretty much were grabbing, basically what was taught in studio for many, many years. But sometimes I think that's the problem is as architects, we can be very anti-public in a lot of ways. We think that we're always looking for the new garage band. We don't, and when our garage band goes, once Pearl Jam hits and it's no longer the guys that you're just seeing in the local club and they become nationally renowned, it's like one of those things we want to turn away and go find the next niche.
The next one.
It's a tough thing because I think that it's so funny. I have my family, my kids and stuff, and you'd be surprised we don't live in anything crazy as far as our neighborhood because we like neighbors. And it's funny when I walk around that so many of my neighbors, they built what they believe is their dream house, and mine's like we bought it because when we moved in, Amy, we needed to get something right, and right now we're at the point where we like our neighbors and we kind of fit there. And it's more sustainable not to buy and build a new house. I mean, those are the type of things we do. But it is interesting that the fact that I think we're quite strange as a profession sometimes. I think all designers, and when you're talking at the beginning, it's like, I think the advertising industry is another one there. It's like some of the eclectic loves and things that people in the ad. I mean, I've always been a huge fan of advertising. I mean, I studied it in college, and I always thought I was either going to do beer commercials or buildings, and ultimately buildings won over. I mean, because I spent my time with you and everybody at HDR to get started. But I think that they're another one where it's like their lust for unique things and music. I mean, specifically, like usually you find a lot of ad agency folks. I mean, they're in bands. They end up doing things with music. They end up they're incredibly well read. I mean, I like hanging out with that crew as well because they are definitely always someone that you come away richer for once you get a chance to hang out with them.
That's right. And you mentioned IDEO. And I tell people, like, I learned design thinking before design thinking was a thing. I just learned it from architects because that's how they do their work every single day. So for people who want to know more about your background, where can they go and find out more about you? And because I know you have some other special projects that you're working on.
Usually you can just go to the HDR Inc. website and just kind of type my name in, and a couple things will pop up. It's like a couple of things that we are interested in right now. I throw out there that on November 5th, we're doing a symposium at the University of Kansas with them on their Center for Rural Health, where we're talking with the Brian Alexander, who wrote the great book, Life and Death of a Small Hospital. It was on the New York Times bestseller. We'll be there, and a couple of administrators. And that's one of those things that right now, in addition to all the great design stuff we're doing here at the Great Plains Studio, is my advocacy. A lot of it is because of some of it is personal passion. Another one is my wife's family comes from a town in western Nebraska where they're farming primarily, and I'm seeing what's going on with that rural health issue, and it's one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. So, and I always like to go out there and be goofy and be the guy that they always wonder why their brother-in-law takes pictures of grain silos. Just kind of a nut.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask you one last question. For anybody who has that kind of borderline interest in architecture and wants to know more, but doesn't want to feel overwhelmed to start their journey and their architecture interest, where would you point them to find out more information?
Well, I mean, if you like it, on a great, easy one on the internet is Arc Daily. I think that you get a great mix on that, or Archetizer. Both of them I think are fantastic as far as the media are there. The other one, though, is I would offer to any of you that if you're in a community where you do have a university that has a college of architecture and design, call the dean up and go meet with them. I think it's one where, we've been talking about this whole time. It's like, as opposed to just looking up on the internet, I think that's a great way to go and experience it firsthand. And I think that some of the friendships that you might make with some of either the faculty and the staff, or even possibly the students in those organizations, I think that serves all of us well. I honestly believe in our business, our connection back to the academy, young students, again, are creative because the fact that for the most part, when they show up, they are open individuals. They haven't been closed off by conversations about budgets or material performance or all of these things that we learn over time as in our careers. I mean, we all do it, mean, we have to do it to be good at what we do. I mean, you have to grow and age. But I think that there's a certain amount of, Carla, the last thing I'd probably leave it is like, there is a certain amount of immaturity that comes with creativity. And I think I keep attempting to stay as immature as I can, as long as I can.
Well,
it's harder and
I
harder.
love that. I'm like, never lose the childlike wonder of the world, I think is really important. And I know that can be hard when we get beat down by the reality of the world. So
you can only imagine in a board meeting, immaturity is not always a good thing.
It has been a true joy having you join me. We have been longtime friends. I've always learned something new from you and also been inspired. So thank you for making time for joining us today on Connect the Dots.
It was awesome, and continued success to you and to all of the folks that look to you for counsel. It's one where I can say Carla is a wealth of that, and I've always appreciated the opportunities that I've had for her counsel to help inform my next steps. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For everyone, we'll drop some links down in the comments below for some of the resources that Tom mentioned. I encourage you, take a deeper look at the world around you. I think it was Frank Lloyd Wright who said, we first create the buildings and then the buildings create us in our neighborhoods. So think about that. Think about the environment in which you live and how it is conducive to or holds you back from some of that creative thinking that you want to do. I'm Carla Johnson. That's it for this episode of Connect the Dots. Thanks for joining me.